Thank you everyone so much for spending your evening with us. I'm really excited to get the chance to talk to you about some of the yellow perch research I did as part of my graduate work at the University of Notre Dame. I would want to start with acknowledgements. This wouldn't have been possible without some fantastic co-authors, both from Notre Dame, Loyola, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, Central Michigan University, as well as funding from Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, whom I now work for, and then Wisconsin Sea Grant as well. So I'm really excited to talk to you about perch because they're one of my favorite fish, and they are a favorite among anglers. They are not only an important part of the recreational fishery in Lake Michigan, but they also are an important part of the nearshore ecosystem, especially within the nearshore food webs. And not to mention, they're just a pretty delicious part as well, as we can probably acknowledge here in the height of fish fry season. But as many of you probably in this room, I don't need to tell, the numbers of yellow perch have fluctuated a lot over the years. And they, in recent years, compared to the 1980s, 1990s, we've seen a pretty dramatic decline. And a lot of this has been due to the lack of young perch reaching maturity, a process we call recruitment. And so when we're trying to think about this part of the ecosystem, why are we not seeing as many adult perch? We really want to get a better handle on, what changes in the ecosystem might be contributing to this. And Lake Michigan has had, a lot of changes since the 1980s, since the 1990s, and we've had some big alterations to the food web due to a pretty small invasive species, the zebra and quagga mussels. And when these guys got established in the lake, they really changed things up in the food web because they're filter feeders who feed on plankton from the water column, and plankton happens to be really critical food source for young yellow perch. And in doing this filter feeding from the water column, they've actually changed the food web from being more open water, where you've got the zooplankton, kind of distributed throughout the water column, to a food web that's really dominated by these bottom organisms, what we call benthos or benthic. So this food web has changed dramatically since the 1990s. And it may, because of these changes, there's some thought that coastal wetlands, which are, few and far between down on this part of the lake, but kind of throughout Green Bay, along the Michigan shoreline, have become more important. And that's not to say they're not already important. These are really productive ecosystems. If you've ever been to something called a marsh, a swamp, wetlands have a lot of primary productivity. And because of that, there's some thought that they may be providing energy that helps support some of these nearshore food webs, including the yellow perch. But like the rest of the lake, they've undergone changes as well. The Chicago region actually used to be a big swamp, essentially a big marsh. But the loss of these wetlands is not just, Lake Michigan based. Across the basin, we've lost about half of all historical coastal wetland area. And even the wetlands we do have left, I may have gotten overeager. There we go. Even the wetlands we do have left face a litany of threats, everything from fragmentation to the loss of connectivity with the lake. So, organisms can't move between habitats, pollution, invasive species, the kind of usual suspects. So we've got these important habitats that may be helping support the food web and yellow perch that are being reduced, but now we're trying to figure out, okay, how actually are fish using these coastal wetland habitats? And when we think about how habitats are connected, things like the coastal wetland and nearshore Lake Michigan are connected, not only physically through the exchange of water, waves moving organisms between these places, things like plankton moving with the waves, but you also have, there we go. You also have the movement of organisms such as yellow perch between these habitats, moving energy from one habitat to the other. And in the case of yellow perch, typically young yellow perch are found in shallow areas, a lot of times coastal wetlands that are really productive, sort of nursery habitats. But when they leave the wetlands, as they become older, they can move to the near shore, potentially becoming prey for other predatory fish and moving that wetland-derived energy to the nearshore food web. I promise I will figure this out eventually. Yeah, if you don't mind clicking it, yeah. But this direction of energy is not necessarily wetland to nearshore only. We also have adult perch that move back into the wetlands to spawn and have that nursery habitat for their young, as well as just for refuge or for foraging. So we really wanted to quantify both sides of this equation. And that led to our main research questions of, essentially just how do yellow perch use coastal wetlands throughout Lake Michigan and the resources, so prey items that they have in the wetlands compared to the nearshore lake. And once we had an idea about that, how does that vary with age? Or how are adults using wetlands compared to the juveniles? Oh, too fast. There we go. Thank you, Peter. So this was part of a larger study where we sampled 7 paired coastal wetland nearshore sites across 3 different regions of Lake Michigan, Green Bay, the Michigan shoreline, and then here in the southern Lake Michigan. And obviously for purposes of today's talk, I'm going to focus on some of our southern sites that may be familiar. The first is our Calumet site, which involves the Lake Calumet, Calumet River kind of wetland complex, as well as a nearshore site kind of off Whiting Beach, Hammond, Indiana area. We also sampled Burns Harbor, which involves a wetland complex that's part of the east arm of the Little Calumet River, as well as the nearshore that's kind of off the Dunes National Park, where the US Steel kind of connection meets. And so when we went out to sample, we sampled 2 summers, basically for everything, a perch would want to eat. Things from zooplankton and phytoplankton to invertebrates, using our dip nets to, catch lots of different bugs and prey fish as well. So we wanted to get representatives of all components of the food web. There we go. Too fast. Well, so essentially we caught a decent number of perch across our 2 years of sampling, and we wanted to analyze them sort of in separate groups. So the first group, and I'll kind of refer to these groups as we move through the results. The first group is what we called large yellow perch. And so 5.5 inches might not seem super large, but the reason we chose that was because that's about the size when perch shift from being more plankton eating and more small invertebrates to larger invertebrates and small fish. And then we focused on perch that we collected in the nearshore and perch that we collected in the wetland to see if those showed different amounts of resource use. And then obviously in contrast, we had our small yellow perch, those below 5.5 inches, but that same habitat distinction of nearshore collected and wetland collected. And so if you're thinking to yourself, you're like, okay, you collected this fish in this habitat. Was it just, passing through that habitat, or has it actually been living there, a representative of this habitat? And we had the same question. So what we did is we used kind of an unlikely source to help us fill in some data gaps in, figuring out where a fish had spent its time. And that's what's called an otolith, or a fish ear bone. And otoliths are super cool. Maybe, because they're these calcium carbonate structures in a fish's ear that forms over the course of a fish's life. It keeps growing as the fish ages. And it forms these rings that we can count, kind of like tree rings, to get an idea of, a fish's age. But in that growth, it also incorporates elements from the fish's environment. And we can analyze those elements and get sort of chemical signatures across life that, if we pair with water chemistry, we can have an idea of where a fish was spending its time at different points in its life cycle. And so just to show an example of what this looks like in practice, I'm going to show one element for two fish, one collected from the Lake Calumet wetland, one collected from nearshore Lake Michigan. And this is for the element strontium within the otolith. And don't worry too much about, any of the specific numbers, but what you can see is that the wetland collected perch and the nearshore collected perch kind of show different chemical signatures across life. And this corresponds with higher strontium in the water in the coastal wetland. And so with that in mind, to answer that question about was a fish just passing through a habitat or did it actually, spend time there, we looked at multiple different elements in the otolith. And this is kind of a complicated figure, but the main thing to take away from it is that chemistry of the most recent material that was deposited, so basically most recently experienced conditions, the chemistry is distinct. Those two polygons that don't overlap at all. If the chemistry was more similar, we would expect that they would overlap a lot for fish collected from the nearshore and wetland, but we can see some distinct separation that suggests, at least in the recent past, these guys were spending their time in the habitats where we collected them. And just as a contrast, showing you kind of the same thing we did, but for Muskegon, and here it's a little bit more, there's some overlap suggesting that perhaps there was more movement in the recent past for these fish. But just to show you that, at least for our Calumet site here in the south, we saw some distinct separation, and the same held for Burns Harbor. So, okay, we know, we feel confident the fish we collected in the habitats, been spending time in those habitats. Now, how the heck do we figure out what these fish have been eating? And, did it come from the wetland or from the near shore? And there's a couple of different ways you can, find out what a fish is eating, since they, don't exactly tell us what's been on the menu. And the first are the stomach contents. And so this is kind of the gold standard of fish diets, either making a fish basically puke up what it's been eating or cutting it open. And this is good, but it often gives us an incomplete picture because their digestion rates can vary. It only can show what's most recently been consumed. So what we paired our stomach contents data with was a technique known as stable isotopes. And without getting into the, chemistry weeds of this, essentially it's different versions of elements such as nitrogen and carbon that can be distinct depending on the habitat you collected it from. And so our wetland isotopes are different than our nearshore isotopes. And all that to say, when you look at then the muscle of a fish and measure the isotopes in it, you can see, okay, this is more wetland energy versus more nearshore. And so the plus of stable isotopes is that they reflect diet over a longer period of time, on the order of months compared to maybe hours or days for stomach contents. So now the grand finale, now that I've, spent your time leading up to this, what actually did we find? And, how are perch using these wetlands? So I'm going to do kind of a similar setup for each of those 4 groups of perch I mentioned, starting with our large nearshore collected perch. And what I'm showing you is essentially for both southern sites, Burns Harbor and Calumet, how much of the diet, so the percent contribution to diet from nearshore resources in the blue and wetland resources in the green. And the main takeaway from this is that for large perch living in the near shore, we found that at Burns Harbor, about 25% or a quarter of their diet appeared to originate in the adjacent wetland. It was slightly lower for Calumet, somewhere closer to about 10–12%. And when we dive into that a little bit more specifically for Burns Harbor, the stable isotopes are great because they give you this accumulated energy, but we also can't get super specific. So in some cases, it's like nearshore invertebrates. So when I say that, I'm talking about things like bloodworms or chironomids. things like scuds, amphipods, and then we also have kind of these broad prey categories like alewife or shiners, things that are isotopically distinct. So with that kind of caveat, we did find, a majority of the resources used in the nearshore were alewife, inverts, spot-tail shiners, things we would kind of expect. But what was interesting is the presence of wetland invertebrates and wetland cestin, which is essentially a mix of phytoplankton and zooplankton, floaty stuff in the water, that was contributing in large part to their diets. And our thought on why that might be the case for these perch living in the nearshore is if you've been to Burns Harbor and there's this east arm of the Little Calumet River, there's often a plume that extends out into the nearshore. And so our thought is some of this cestin or plankton and inverts are potentially in that plume and getting incorporated into the nearshore food web that way. Oh, wrong way. There we go. So for Calumet, a little bit of a different story. Maybe there we go. Here we can see actually more reliance, so a bigger contribution of nearshore invertebrates to their diet compared to things like nearshore shiners or alewife. But we do have some invertebrate signature coming from the wetlands. So there potentially movement between the two, but as we saw with the otoliths, there didn't appear to be a lot of recent movement. So that may suggest that these wetland resources, again, are coming through like the Calumet River, being transported to the near shore, and having that connectivity in that way, sort of with these plumes. And so I just want to do a quick, show you some of our other results for these nearshore large perch, compared to a site Muskegon in the east, as well as Little Sturgeon, which is in Green Bay. And so Little Sturgeon is like the most physically connected of the wetlands we sampled in this study. So it kind of makes sense that there's a lot of exchange between the two. But Burns Harbor is not all that different than Little Sturgeon, where you have this high rate of physical connectivity between the wetlands. And so to kind of run you through some our small nearshore perch then. So these again are guys that are below 5.5 inches. This was actually kind of really surprising to me, is that a majority of their diet, around 65%, appeared to originate in the adjacent wetland. And if you remember, this was the site where you have that big plume coming out from the east arm of the Little Calumet. And cestin, again, this plankton, zooplankton mix, was by far the largest contribution to these small perches diet. And while we didn't collect small perch from the Calumet nearshore, I just want to show a comparison to Little Sturgeon. Again, this is a highly connected site in Green Bay, and we're seeing, again, a lot of this wetland resource use at Burns Harbor. Now for large perch collected from the wetland, we only had them from Calumet. We sampled 2 years at Burns Harbor and didn't collect any yellow perch from the wetland or the river system. But at Calumet, it seems like life is good in the wetland. They don't have to go out to the near shore for any resources. They've got plenty of choice there. Main point to make with Calumet in their specific use of resources is their highest contribution, single contribution, were wetland spot tail shiners. So again, maybe not super surprising, but kind of in line with what we expected. Calumet was kind of interesting when you compare it to some of the other wetlands we sampled around the Great Lakes, in that all of the adult yellow perch living in this wetland didn't appear to use any resources from other habitats. Whereas when you have sites like Muskegon that have this drowned river mouth, which is sort of an intermediate connector between the nearshore Lake Michigan and the wetland, you have both nearshore and this drowned river mouth contributing resources as well. So it appears that there's more use of different habitats for wetland perch in other ecosystems across Lake Michigan. Oh, I think I went too far. Maybe Peter, I'll let you. Perfect, thank you. And so finally, when we look at small perch collected in the wetland, again, same story with Calumet, complete wetland resource use. What I found really interesting here, and something we hypothesize, is that, okay, so wetland alewife was the largest contribution to small wetland perch, which seems a little odd that these small guys would be eating alewife, but the alewife signature was also very similar to the plankton because alewife are basically just eat plankton. So it may be that the alewife were better incorporating the plankton isotope signal, and that's actually what these guys were eating. But we never found any alewife in their stomachs, which kind of made me wonder about that one. But we think it may be more linked to the fact that we're dealing with these planktivore, this plankton signature. And then finally, one more comparison. Again, Calumet kind of sticks out in that there's no cross-habitat resource use compared to some of these other sites around the lake. And so I apologize, this is kind of small, but just to recap kind of our main takeaways from this is that the large adult perch, both the nearshore and the wetland collected, most of their energy is coming from the habitat where they were collected. But this varies by region. And in some places you have greater cross-habitat resource use. And, you know, actually in the South, Burns Harbor, that a quarter of the diet, I don't think is anything to sniff at. But when we look at juveniles, you know, in some places in the lake, these cross-habitat or adjacent habitat resources make up pretty significant contributions overall to their diet. And so what to kind of take away from that from a fishing or a management side of things is that we found that perch are using these resources across a variety of coastal habitats, whether it's a coastal wetland, a river plume, a nearshore or a drowned river mouth lake. They use this sort of mosaic of habitats across life and providing a lot of important resources. And so when we're thinking about how to manage, not only perch, but other fish species that may have these potential linkages too, it's really important to, consider the maintenance of connectivity between habitats. Basically, can fish move and use multiple habitats across life, both for that specific species that we're interested in, as well as the greater Lake Michigan food web. And so I know I've taken a decent chunk of your time and I want to make sure I have time for some questions, but just to leave you with my final take-home points, we found that yellow perch use resources from both nearshore and coastal wetland habitats, with, in some cases, over half of their assimilated energy actually originating in another habitat. And we had to use multiple different scientific approaches to get at this question, from the stomach contents and stable isotopes that helped us understand what they were consuming, as well as that otolith chemistry that helped us figure out, at least some recent habitat use. And when we think about how to manage yellow perch in Lake Michigan and help ensure that these ecosystems keep functioning the way we want them to function, it really is going to depend on having multiple habitats that can be accessed by organisms or have that connectivity between them. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. And if there is time, Peter, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you saying the Calumet are in there all year?
It appears that way. The perch that are in Lake Calumet are not frequently making trips out to the nearshore. Yep. So there's not like any exchange for them, but the perch that are in the nearshore at Calumet are consuming wetland resources. Now, whether or not that means they're going into the river and the wetland itself versus those resources being swept out to them, we don't have a conclusive answer on that.
I noticed that you didn't have any gobies in there.
So
I was curious, but we know they're pretty abundant.
we do know they're super abundant. Yeah. So we did collect round gobies and we ran them in our models, but it never came out as an important contribution to yellow perch diet, which I found kind of surprising because, again, you know, they're super abundant. But we found them in 1 or 2 stomachs, but not widespread. But I'm sure you guys have probably caught them. If you've seen stomachs, we'd be interested in hearing about that. But it at least appeared for the perch that we collected, and this was back in 2014, 2015. So again, the lake is always changing too. So at least at the time we were sampling, the gobies didn't appear to come out in our models as being an important contribution, but good question. Yeah.
The perch population out of Waukegan gone away. And I remember 15, 18 years ago, you'd see hundreds of boats out there. Now there's none.
So there have been several years of really poor recruitment. Again, those young of years not making it to adulthood. And there's also been a kind of skewed sex ratio too. Like we have a lot more females in the lake than we have males. And it's kind of like this compounding thing. So, you know, you've got several years of low populations and they're just not recovering to those extent that we saw, you know, even years ago. I think the last, and someone might fact check me on this, we had a good year class 2015, I think. Yeah. But
16.
was 16 good too? Yeah. Yeah. And so you have some years where you have a good year class. And perch populations have fluctuated naturally too, but we also think that the invasive mussels filter feeding and taking away this plankton resource has really done a number on them as well. So that wasn't really an answer to your question, but I think over the years, since the 1990s, we've seen kind of more years rather than not where we've had these poor recruitment events. Yeah.
Did your study include any indication of water clarity? Because that's when really the zebra mussels cleared the water, is when the perch crash.
Yep. So no, that's.
Did you find any indication of cannibalism? I know perch will eat just about anything.
Yeah, perch will definitely. So I didn't show it in these results, but especially on the eastern Michigan sites, so the Michigan coastline, Pentwater, Muskegon, we saw high rates of cannibalism up there. We didn't see as much down here in the south. They definitely seem to eat more of the invertebrates, both based on the models and what we saw in the stomachs in these southern sites. But cannibalism was definitely exactly. Yeah, because like you said, and we didn't measure water quality directly or water clarity directly. We did measure some things like dissolved nutrients in the water, and did a little bit of, you know, looking at that. But the part of the reason these wetlands might be increasingly important is because they generally are not as cloudy. Exactly. Yeah, there's definitely, the wetlands have a lot more turbidity in addition to just having a lot more nutrients and a lot more prey items for these fish. Yeah.
So I know you guys didn't do research around here, but how does it apply, like, for instance, like our harbor here, because there's no wetlands here?
Yeah.
Just straight up, like, how do they might just hang out in the harbor and then come out, or is it like the plume from our river here that?
So the plume is a potential source. You know, you have the rivers that are draining these watersheds, potentially bringing some more resources. We do have pretty limited coastal wetlands down here in our side of the lake. So it's not that they necessarily, like they can live on the stuff that's in the lake itself, but our results kind of suggest that the wetlands might just be helping provide a little bit more energy in the light of the zebra mussels and quagga mussels, basically taking a lot of that energy out of the system. So maybe that's in part why in some places around here, they're struggling a little bit more because there's just not enough food to go around. Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly hard to find invertebrates in some of these nearshore places. Like you're just not finding anything other than quagga or zebra mussels. So again, not super an answer to your question, but yeah, essentially like the wetlands kind of help supplement that food web and may make that, you know, the nearshore perch more, you know, perhaps more abundant in the places where they have access to that. Whereas in, you know, places where they may not have as frequent access, it's more of a, you know, all hands or basically every fish for itself.
Like the ones that are on Cape Cod lost or something like that, because it's not like how they think, why would they be here in a sense? So,
Well, yeah, there's no food. I mean, yeah, and they're exploiting different habitats. You know, anyone who's done perch fishing, it's like, you know, they're exploiting different temperature gradients too. So on like the currents might be moving them around, but yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Did you study of what size of fry becomes viable?
We didn't do that. I know there's some people working on that, especially trying to figure out when the fry become viable, when they alewives. Yeah, so like what size do they elude predation from alewives or gobies, you know, but we didn't necessarily do that in this study, and I'm not as up to date on where they're at with some of the work that's been done there. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie.
I
think
yeah. Oh, sorry.
Has anyone ever, so my thought for this is, and I don't think anyone's ever thought about this, but back in the day, and again, I know the invasives are very important as to changing the lake. But we used to have commercial fishing that took thousands and thousands of pounds of yellow perch per year. And there's no commercial fishing, so does nature back off and the whole, like, there's no supply and demand? So if the demand is not as necessary, does nature hold back the supply? Because I do know, I'm not familiar with Green Bay fishery, but I do know that they still have
They do still have a commercial
fishing up there, which in maybe just a few years ago, they increased their yellow perch poundage. So I'm just curious if anyone's ever gone to that.
Yeah, exploring that relationship.
Demand that nature holds back. If there was more demand with the supply, would nature supply more? I mean,
no, it's an interesting thought, and like you said, there is still a commercial fishery in Green Bay. I think what we found is that yellow perch are not the only fish species that have had this impact from the invasive species. So it's not sure if it's necessarily like that there's an absence of demand. It's more that there's just not a lot of food for them to eat relative to the days when they were having these peaks. I can't say I'm as familiar with more of like the focus on, you know, does opening up that allow for more fish? But I would think it's mostly from the bottom up rather than a top down kind of like fishing pressure. Just the fact that you go out there, I mean, if you look through the water, the clarity issues, the zooplankton and plankton that they need just isn't there anymore. But that I think, you know, that's a really interesting question, and be interesting to see if anyone's done work on that. I'm not sure if anyone has, but thank you. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, a lot of these are great questions. A lot of, and many of these things